October 24, 1944. 0400 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The night was thick with humidity, and the sea was a black mirror stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A storm of war was brewing, and every man in the Pacific knew it. Far above the silent waves, a low, thunderous hum began to grow, steady, powerful, and relentless. It was the sound of America's secret angels of destruction, the long-range bombers that could shatter steel and set the ocean ablaze. From the darkness, 120 American bombers, a deadly mix of B-24 Liberators and PB-4Y, 2 privateers, cut through the clouds in perfect formation. Their destination, the Japanese center force, a heavily armed fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Somewhere below, dozens of Imperial Japanese Navy warships, including the massive battleship Musashi, cruised forward, unaware that by the end of the day, they would be reduced to flaming, twisted wreckage. On the American side, Rear Admiral Ralph Ofstey's Task Force 77 had been tracking the Japanese movements for hours. Through the crackle of radio chatter, a calm but deadly serious order came from the USS Enterprise. Target confirmed. All squadrons, prepare for attack. Make every bomb count. The Pacific sky began to glow faintly with the approaching dawn, and with it came the first glimmer of metal on the horizon. Japanese ships, sleek and menacing, slicing through the water like predators. The moment was tense. In the bellies of the bombers, young American crewmen checked their payloads. 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, incendiary canisters, and torpedoes. Enough firepower to turn even the proudest battleship into a floating inferno. Below deck on the Musashi, Japanese sailors were going through their morning drills, completely unaware that death was descending from the clouds. Kurita himself, a veteran of countless naval engagements, stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. His orders from Tokyo were clear: push through the American defensive lines and disrupt the landings at Leyte. But Kurita didn't yet know that the Americans had already anticipated his every move. At 0700 hours, the first American reconnaissance plane swooped low, its camera lenses capturing every detail of the Japanese formation. Kurita's staff recognized the threat, but by the time the alarms rang out, it was already too late. The bombers were less than 20 minutes away. From the distance, the roar of engines became a deafening wall of sound. The leading wave of Liberators broke through the clouds, sunlight catching their silver fuselages. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. American pilots, peering through their bomb sights, could see the decks of the enemy warships dotted with tiny figures scrambling in panic. Then, the first bombs dropped. They fell in slow, graceful arcs until they struck. The first explosion ripped into the Musashi's forward deck, sending a geyser of steel and seawater hundreds of feet into the air. Almost instantly, thick black smoke boiled upward, and the smell of burning oil rolled across the water. On the Japanese flagship, chaos erupted. Damage control teams scrambled, hoses hissed, and shouted orders were nearly drowned out by the hiss of steam and the crackle of flames. But this was just the beginning. High above, more bomber squadrons took their turns, diving in precision attacks. Each pass was more devastating than the last. The Americans weren't just aiming to disable these ships, they intended to annihilate them. In the span of minutes, the calm waters of the Leyte Gulf were transformed into a scene from hell itself. Towering plumes of smoke, fireballs blooming on the waves, and the echoes of exploding ammunition rattling through the air. Still, Kurita refused to retreat. Signaling his captains, he barked, "Press forward. Our duty is to fight to the last ship." His words were defiant, but deep inside, he knew this battle was slipping from his grasp. The Americans had the skies, and in modern naval warfare, that was everything. On the Enterprise, pilots were already preparing for a second wave. This was not just an air raid. It was the opening strike in a calculated, merciless campaign that would burn its way into the history books. And as the morning sun climbed higher, the full fury of America's bombing power was only beginning to reveal itself. The sun had barely risen over the vast Pacific on June 19, 1944, but the waters of the Philippine Sea were already alive with the distant hum of aircraft engines. The United States Navy's massive Task Force 58, under the command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, had been shadowing the Imperial Japanese Navy for days. Intelligence reports from intercepted Japanese communications, decoded by the codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, had revealed that the Japanese fleet was making a desperate push to reinforce their positions in the Mariana Islands. The goal was clear: repel the American invasion of Saipan, which had begun just 3 days earlier on June 15, 1944. But the Americans had prepared for this moment. Out there, somewhere across the horizon, was Admiral Jisuburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, a formidable strike force including 3 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. In the eyes of many Japanese officers, it was still an armada to be feared. Yet, beneath the surface of that confidence was a hard truth. Japan's naval aviation was no longer what it once had been. Many of their best pilots had been lost in earlier battles like Midway and Guadalcanal, replaced now by young, inexperienced airmen with barely enough training to land on a carrier deck. For Mitchell, the challenge was not just finding Ozawa. It was catching him before nightfall. The American carriers USS Essex, USS Yorktown, CV-10, USS Hornet, CV-12, and the legendary USS Enterprise, CV-6, were poised to strike, with their decks crowded with F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Hundreds of aircraft waited, their pilots in ready rooms, gripping coffee mugs and nervously glancing at the big wall maps showing the latest reconnaissance reports. At 8:15 a.m., radar operators aboard the carrier USS Lexington picked up faint blips, incoming aircraft at extreme range, about 150 miles out. They were coming in fast and in waves. Bogies inbound, Vector 120, came the voice over the Combat Information Center's loudspeakers. This was it. The Japanese had launched first. Mitchell's response was immediate. Launch all fighters. Within minutes, the decks of the carriers erupted into motion. F-6F Hellcats, painted in deep navy blue with white star and bar insignia, roared into the air, climbing toward the sun to gain the advantage. The first wave of 30 Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 15, VF-15, met the Japanese Vals, Kates, and Zeros head-on at 20,000 feet. The result would later be remembered as part of the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter in the skies. The Hellcats, with their superior speed, armor, and firepower, tore through the Japanese formations. Pilots like Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb and Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu downed multiple enemy planes in single sorties. Vrashu himself destroyed 6 in a single engagement, his guns blazing as burning Zero wreckage spiraled down into the ocean. But the Japanese still pressed forward, desperate to land a blow on the American carriers. At 9:35 a.m., a lone group of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers managed to break through. Anti-aircraft guns aboard the USS Bunker Hill and USS Wasp opened up, filling the sky with deadly black bursts. 2 torpedo planes were blown apart midair, their debris raining into the waves. A third plane came in low, skimming just above the water, only to be shredded by a wall of .50 caliber machine gun fire from an escorting destroyer. None reached their targets. By midday, the Japanese had already lost over 150 aircraft in the first round of attacks, most of them with their pilots. American losses? Barely a handful of planes, and only a few damaged ships. Mitcher's voice on the radio was calm but commanding. Maintain pursuit. We'll finish them before sunset. At 14:30, American search planes located Ozawa's fleet. The coordinates came back, 15 degrees north, 137 degrees east. The Japanese carriers were desperately trying to regroup, their flight decks littered with the wreckage of returning planes. Mitcher gave the order, all strike groups, launch. It was a breathtaking sight. Over 200 American planes lifting off in tight succession, their wings catching the afternoon light as they roared toward the horizon. Among them were Helldivers armed with 1,000-pound bombs and Avengers carrying deadly Mark 13 torpedoes. The attack hit just after 1600 hours. The carrier Hyo was the first to be struck. A bomb slammed into her hangar deck, igniting stored fuel and sending flames racing through her interior. Secondary explosions ripped her apart, forcing her crew to abandon ship. Meanwhile, the carrier Zuikaku, one of the few survivors of the Battle of Midway, took multiple bomb hits that wrecked her flight deck and left her listing heavily. The light carrier Chiyoda was crippled, her steering jammed, and engines knocked out. As the sun dipped lower, the Americans faced a terrible choice. They were more than 250 miles from their carriers, with night falling fast. Flying back in darkness over open ocean was dangerous, too dangerous for many inexperienced pilots. Yet Mitchell made a bold call. Turn on the lights. One by one, the American carriers broke blackout discipline, switching on every deck light, searchlight, and signal lamp to guide their aircrews home. It was a beacon in the night, and an open invitation to any lurking Japanese submarines. The risk paid off. Nearly all the strike force made it back, though dozens of planes ran out of fuel and ditched in the sea near their ships. Rescue destroyers roamed the waves in the darkness, pulling freezing, oil-soaked pilots from the water. By the time the battle ended the next day, the Japanese had lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft. More than 1,000 sailors and pilots were dead. The Imperial Navy's offensive capability in the Pacific was shattered forever. For the Americans, it was a victory not just of strength, but of strategy, training, and the relentless will to hunt the enemy down. And yet, for all the triumph, the war was far from over. The Japanese fleet still had battleships lurking in the shadows, and the fight for the Pacific would soon shift to an even bloodier stage. The waters off Leyte Gulf, where American bombers would once again turn Japanese warships into floating infernos. If you want, I can immediately move to part 3 so the flow continues without losing the cinematic momentum. That way, by the time we hit part 6, it'll read like a complete war documentary. The echoes of the Philippine Sea victory had barely faded when the next great battle of the Pacific loomed. It was October 1944, and the U.S. Navy was in the middle of its most ambitious amphibious operation yet, the liberation of the Philippines. The stakes were not just strategic, but deeply personal for General Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to leave the islands in 1942 under Japanese assault. Now, with the landing at Leyte Gulf underway, MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return," was being fulfilled. But the Japanese were not about to let Leyte fall without a fight. Their plan, codenamed Shogo 1, was desperate and complex. 3 separate naval forces would converge on the Leyte invasion fleet. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, would push through the sea-beyond sea and strike the landing beaches from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would attack through the Surigao Strait. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's battered carriers, now mostly empty of aircraft, would act as bait, luring the powerful American carrier groups away from Kurita's main force. On the morning of October 24, 1944, Kurita's center force was spotted moving through the narrow waters of the Sibuyan Sea. The U.S. Third Fleet, under Admiral William Bull Halsey, ordered its carrier task groups to strike immediately. Among them was Task Group 38.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, with carriers USS Essex, USS Lexington, and USS Princeton ready for battle. At 8:10 a.m., the first wave of American aircraft, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, launched into the tropical sky. Their primary target, the behemoth Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato and one of the largest battleships ever built. Displacing over 72,000 tons and armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, Musashi was a floating fortress, but one vulnerable to relentless aerial attack. The first dive-bombing run came from VB-15, flying SB-2C Helldivers off the USS Essex. The bombers swooped down through bursts of flak, releasing 1,000-pound bombs that crashed into Musashi's deck armor, sending columns of smoke skyward. Moments later, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from VT-18 closed in low, their Mark 13 torpedoes streaking through the green waters toward her massive hull. Several detonations rocked the giant ship, flooding compartments and slowing her speed. By 10:30 a.m., a second wave was on its way. This time, aircraft from USS Intrepid and USS Franklin joined the assault. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fought back ferociously, filling the air with black puffs of exploding shells. Many American planes came back riddled with holes. Some didn't return at all, but the strikes kept coming. At 12:45 p.m., a third wave struck, and this time, Musashi began to list noticeably to port. Multiple torpedo hits had jammed her rudder and flooded her engine rooms. Even so, she continued to fire her massive guns at any plane in range, her crew refusing to abandon ship. The American pilots could see men scrambling on her deck, some trying to douse fires, others dragging wounded shipmates to safety. By late afternoon, after more than 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes, Musashi's fate was sealed. At 7:36 p.m., she capsized and sank bow first into the Philippine Sea, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. The loss of such a colossal warship was a devastating blow to Japanese morale, but Kurita's force still pressed on toward the San Bernardino Strait. While the battle in the Philippine Sea raged, another drama unfolded to the north. At 9:38 a.m., a massive explosion tore through the light carrier USS Princeton, CVL-23, after a Japanese bomb detonated on her hangar deck. Fires spread rapidly, and despite heroic firefighting efforts, the order to abandon ship was given. At 5:50 p.m., Princeton was scuttled to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. The loss of the ship was a stark reminder that victory in the Pacific came at a cost. That night, Kurita unexpectedly ordered his center force to retreat, shaken by the loss of Musashi and fearing he was heading into a trap. Yet, in the early hours of October 25th, he would reverse his decision, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic clashes in naval history, the Battle off Samar, where small American escort carriers and destroyers would face the full fury of Japan's remaining battleships and cruisers. And when dawn broke over the horizon, the air would once again fill with the roar of American bombers, hunting Japanese steel and turning it into burning wreckage on the sea. The night after Musashi's demise, the waters of the Philippine archipelago seemed deceptively calm. But in the darkness, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, minus its giant flagship, steamed toward the San Bernardino Strait. His remaining ships were still formidable: Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, backed by heavy cruisers and destroyers, bristled with enough firepower to crush anything in their path. Kurita's objective was simple and devastating: smash through to the Leyte landing beaches, annihilate the U.S. invasion fleet, and cripple MacArthur's entire operation. If he succeeded, the liberation of the Philippines could be delayed by months, perhaps longer. What Kurita didn't know was that Admiral Halsey, lured north by Ozawa's decoy carriers, had taken the bulk of the U.S. Third Fleet far away from the San Bernardino Strait. The only American warships left in his path belonged to Task Unit April 3rd, 77, nicknamed Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. Taffy 3 was not a strike force. It was a screening unit meant to protect the slow-moving transport and supply ships at Leyte. Its strength lay in 6 small escort carriers, CV, each carrying barely 24 planes, along with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. These ships were lightly armored, slow, and carried nowhere near the firepower of Kurita's armada. On paper, the matchup was suicidal. At 6:37 a.m. on October 25, 1944, a lookout aboard the USS Fanshawe Bay, CV-70, spotted black shapes on the northern horizon. Within minutes, the unmistakable profile of Japanese battleships and cruisers emerged from the mist. Sprague could hardly believe his eyes. The enemy had appeared behind them, where they were least prepared. Enemy surface force in sight, crackled across the radios. And with that, the calm of the morning shattered. Kurita's ships opened fire at 6:58 a.m., the thunder of their 18-inch and 16-inch guns rolling across the waves. Shell splashes erupted around the carriers, some so close that seawater cascaded over their decks. The giant Yamato, firing from over 20 miles away, sent salvo after salvo toward the retreating Americans. Sprague's only option was to order a desperate retreat toward a squall line to the east. At the same time, he launched every available aircraft, armed or not, to harass the approaching enemy. Many planes took off with only half-full fuel tanks and whatever weapons they could load in minutes: depth charges, machine gun belts, even practice bombs. Then came one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in naval history. Knowing the carriers would never outrun the Japanese, the destroyers USS Johnston, DD 557, USS Hull, DD-533, and USS Heermann, DD-532, charged straight at the oncoming battleships and cruisers. Leading the attack was Commander Ernest E. Evans aboard Johnston. "All ahead flank. Prepare to engage," he ordered. Johnston weaved through geysers of shellfire, closing to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano. At 7:24 a.m., Johnston fired a spread of torpedoes. At least one struck Kumano's bow, blowing it open and forcing her out of the fight. But Johnston paid dearly. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo smashed into her engine room, cutting her speed. Yet Evans refused to withdraw. For over an hour, Johnston zigzagged through the battle, firing at anything in range, covering the carriers with her smokescreen. Meanwhile, the USS Hull and USS Heermann threw themselves at the enemy line, launching torpedoes that forced the mighty Yamato to turn away temporarily. This maneuver bought Taffy 3 precious minutes. Overhead, the carrier planes, Wildcats and Avengers from USS Gambier Bay, USS White Plains, and others, made constant attack runs. Some pilots strafed Japanese bridges, others dropped their meager bombs with deadly precision. A few even made dry runs just to distract Japanese gunners. Despite these heroics, the Japanese guns found their marks. At 8 a.m., the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay took multiple hits from the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Fires spread quickly, and within 30 minutes she rolled onto her side and sank, the only American carrier ever lost to enemy surface gunfire. Johnston, now dead in the water, was pummeled by shells from Yamato and several cruisers. At 9:45 a.m., Commander Evans gave the order to abandon ship. He was last seen on the stern, wounded, shouting encouragement to his crew. For his valor, Evans would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. Then, in a moment still debated by historians, Kurita suddenly broke off the attack. He was convinced, wrongly, that he had stumbled upon a much larger carrier group and feared further airstrikes. By 9:20 a.m., he ordered his ships to withdraw north through the San Bernardino Strait, leaving behind burning wreckage and stunned survivors clinging to life rafts. The battle off Samar cost the U.S. Taffy 3 dearly: 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort sunk, with over 1,000 American sailors killed. But they had stopped a vastly superior Japanese force from reaching the invasion fleet. News of their stand would echo through the Navy, the finest hour of the U.S. surface Navy in World War II. For the Japanese, Samar was a crushing psychological defeat. Their last major battleship action in history had been turned back, not by overwhelming force, but by outgunned, outnumbered sailors who refused to run. And as the smoke cleared over Leyte Gulf, American bombers once again took to the skies, ready to finish what they had started in the Sibuyan Sea. As Kurita's battered battleships retreated through the San Bernardino Strait, hundreds of miles to the north, the decoy that had lured Admiral Halsey away from Leyte was about to pay the ultimate price. This was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, for aircraft carriers Zuikaku, Zuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, along with 2 battleships converted into hybrid carriers, Ayase and Hyuga, plus a small screen of cruisers and destroyers. On paper, it looked like a formidable striking arm. In reality, it was bait. By October 25, 1944, these carriers had almost no trained aircrews left. Most of their planes had been lost earlier in the war, and the few that remained were piloted by green recruits. Their mission was not to win. It was to die gloriously, distracting Halsey long enough for Kurita's center force to smash the American invasion fleet. But with Kurita turning back at Samar, the decoy's sacrifice was now pointless, and Halsey's Task Force 38 was bearing down on them at full speed. At 6:45 a.m., radar aboard the USS Lexington, CV-16, and USS Essex, CV-9, picked up Ozawa's carriers on the northern horizon, about 200 miles from Cape Engano. Within minutes, the order went out: launch all strikes. From decks slick with morning dew, wave after wave of American aircraft roared into the pale dawn sky. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The plan was total annihilation. Carriers first, then everything else. By 8 a.m., the first strike group, 60 aircraft strong, dove out of the sun on Zuikaku, the last surviving veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack force. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs and fiery tracers, but the American pilots pressed in. Helldivers screamed downward at over 250 knots, releasing 1,000-pound bombs that tore into Zuikaku's flight deck. Torpedo planes came in low and fast, their wakes carving white scars in the sea. One, then another, slammed into her hull, flooding her engine rooms. Zuikaku began to list, smoke pouring from her stern. By 9 a.m., fires raged uncontrollably. Her crew, many of them barely teenagers, fought to save her, but the damage was too great. At 13:58 p.m., she rolled slowly to port and slipped beneath the waves, taking 842 sailors with her. The carrier that had helped unleash Pearl Harbor was gone. Meanwhile, the smaller carrier Zuho was swarmed by Hellcats and Avengers. Bomb after bomb smashed through her decks, setting off ammunition explosions that turned her into a pillar of flame. She capsized just before noon. The carrier Chitos, caught while maneuvering, took multiple torpedo hits from Avengers off USS Below Wood, CVL 24. She went under within 30 minutes, her crew abandoning ship amid burning fuel slicks. Chiyoda, the last of the four, managed to avoid destruction in the morning strikes but was crippled by bomb damage. By afternoon, she was dead in the water, her decks a twisted ruin. U.S. cruisers closed in at short range, their 8-inch shells ripping her apart until she exploded in a massive fireball just after 1700 hours p.m. October 24, 1944. 0400 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The night was thick with humidity, and the sea was a black mirror stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A storm of war was brewing, and every man in the Pacific knew it. Far above the silent waves, a low, thunderous hum began to grow, steady, powerful, and relentless. It was the sound of America's secret angels of destruction, the long-range bombers that could shatter steel and set the ocean ablaze. From the darkness, 120 American bombers, a deadly mix of B-24 Liberators and PB-4Y, 2 privateers, cut through the clouds in perfect formation. Their destination, the Japanese center force, a heavily armed fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Somewhere below, dozens of Imperial Japanese Navy warships, including the massive battleship Musashi, cruised forward, unaware that by the end of the day, they would be reduced to flaming, twisted wreckage. On the American side, Rear Admiral Ralph Ofstey's Task Force 77 had been tracking the Japanese movements for hours. Through the crackle of radio chatter, a calm but deadly serious order came from the USS Enterprise. Target confirmed. All squadrons, prepare for attack. Make every bomb count. The Pacific sky began to glow faintly with the approaching dawn, and with it came the first glimmer of metal on the horizon. Japanese ships, sleek and menacing, slicing through the water like predators. The moment was tense. In the bellies of the bombers, young American crewmen checked their payloads. 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, incendiary canisters, and torpedoes. Enough firepower to turn even the proudest battleship into a floating inferno. But the destruction did not stop with the carriers. American pilots turned their attention to Ozawa's escorts. The hybrid battleship carrier ISE took repeated bomb hits, her upper works shredded, though she somehow remained afloat and managed to limp away. Hugo was similarly battered but escaped, trailing smoke. The sea north of Luzon was now a graveyard. Oil slicks stretched for miles. The air stank of burning fuel and cordite. Charred planks and pieces of wreckage drifted past lifeboats crammed with dazed Japanese survivors. By sunset, the northern force had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. In exchange for the loss of just a handful of American aircraft, the U.S. Navy had destroyed the last operational Japanese carrier group. From his flagship USS New Jersey, BB-62, Admiral Halsey signaled to the fleet, "The enemy is annihilated." It was a triumph, but a bittersweet one. The victory over Ozawa had come at the cost of leaving Taffy III to fight for its life at Samar without his support. For Japan, Cape Engano marked the end of its once proud carrier arm. In less than 3 years, the fleet that had terrorized the Pacific from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean had been wiped from the seas. From now on, Japan's navy would be a shadow force, unable to mount large-scale carrier operations. As darkness fell over the smoking wreckage, the surviving American pilots flew back to their carriers, their silhouettes gliding against a blood-red sunset. Below them, the ocean still burned in places, the floating infernos that had been Japanese warships glowing like funeral pyres on the horizon. The Pacific War was far from over, but after Leyte Gulf, the tide had turned beyond hope for Japan. And in the months ahead, the skies over the home islands themselves would blaze with the fire of relentless American bombing. The loss of the last Japanese carriers at Cape Engano in October 1944 marked the death of the Imperial Navy's offensive power. But for the American war planners, it was only the opening move in the final act. With the seas now firmly in Allied hands, the path to Japan's home islands lay open, and in Washington and Guam, a new campaign was already taking shape. Its code name was Operation Meeting House, though the men who would carry it out simply called it the Fire Plan. It would unleash destruction on a scale the world had never seen. By late November 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had completed the construction of massive air bases in the recently captured Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From these islands, the new giant of the air war would strike, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. With a wingspan of 141 feet and a maximum bomb load of 20,000 pounds, the B-29 was the most advanced bomber of the war, pressurized cabins, remote-controlled defensive guns, and engines capable of carrying it more than 3,000 miles. From the Marianas, Tokyo was now within reach. At first, the bombing campaign focused on high-altitude, precision attacks against industrial targets, steel plants, aircraft factories, engine works. But winter brought fierce jet stream winds over Japan, scattering bomb patterns and reducing accuracy to almost nothing. In January 1945, American bombs were falling miles from their intended targets. Enter Major General Curtis E. LeMay. A blunt, hard-charging commander with little patience for half measures, LeMay arrived in the Marianas in January with a new strategy. If the jet stream made high-altitude bombing useless, then the bombers would fly low, dangerously low. And instead of heavy armor-piercing bombs, they would carry thousands of incendiaries. Tokyo, like most Japanese cities, was built largely of wood and paper. In LeMay's words, "We'll burn down their cities and make them quit." On the evening of March 9, 1945, the plan went into motion. From airfields on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, 334 B-29s lifted into the night sky. Their destination, the heart of Tokyo. Each carried clusters of M69 incendiary bomblets, napalm-filled canisters designed to burst on impact and spray flaming liquid in all directions. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, the first bombers crossed the Japanese coastline. Flying at just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, they came in under the radar's most effective range. Their engine's deep rumble echoed over a city still asleep. Then, as the lead planes reached their release points, the bomb bays opened. The first waves dropped long, parallel lines of incendiaries, creating giant, glowing X and H patterns over the city, aiming to trap fire crews in a crossfire of blazes. Within minutes, entire districts were ablaze. The second and third waves filled in the gaps, turning neighborhoods into roaring furnaces. The night air turned into a hellish gale. Fires merged into a single, unstoppable firestorm, sucking in oxygen and generating winds over 100 miles per hour. Roofs collapsed, walls caved in, and streets became rivers of flame. Civilians fled toward canals and rivers, only to find the water boiling from the heat. In just over 3 hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. Over 100,000 people lay dead, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. 1 million were left homeless. American pilots flying back to the Marianas could see the glow from 150 miles away. Some spoke of the smell of burning wood and flesh that clung to their uniforms long after they landed. The success, if such a word could be used, was devastating. LeMay's incendiary strategy was unleashed on city after city: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. By the summer of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been reduced to ashes. The nation's industrial production collapsed. Food shortages became desperate. For many Japanese, daily survival meant foraging in the ruins. And yet, Tokyo did not surrender. The Imperial Army still had over 2 million men in the home islands, prepared to fight to the last. In the countryside, women and children drilled with bamboo spears. The war machine was broken, but the will to resist endured. By July 1945, the United States faced a choice: invade Japan at an enormous cost in lives, perhaps 1 million casualties, or find a way to break the nation's spirit entirely. That decision would lead to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. The burning of Tokyo on March 10, 1945, remains one of the most destructive single air raids in history, a reminder of the terrifying power of modern warfare and the human cost it demands. We can study the dates, the tonnage, the casualty figures, but behind every statistic was a life, a story, a family. History offers us lessons, but only if we're willing to face its darkest truths. If you want to keep uncovering the battles, the strategies, and the untold stories of World War II, stay with us. The war isn't over, and the next chapter will take us to the very moment the world changed forever.